Chapter 22, Worldwide Whispers. Instead of going to work the next morning, Mum decided to walk to the bus stop with me. She said it was because me and Tom were famous now, and that even though we probably wouldn't be famous for more than a day, we needed to be careful. "I just want to make sure you're not going to be chased by any reporters," she said, as she helped me put my coat on. "Some of them are good people doing their job, but some of them have absolutely no scruples." I followed Mum out of the flat, wondering what scruples were, because Mum had looked angry when she had said the word, so I knew it was bad not to have any of them. I also wondered why reporters might chase us. Tintin, who has to be one of the best reporters in the world, only ever chased people who were kidnappers or thieves or had done something wrong. When we reached the bus stop, we found Tom's mum and dad there too. Mum went to talk to them, and Tom and I huddled together. Tom said his parents had told him that if he ever ran away from school again, he would be so grounded that he would never see daylight again. But I told Mum it comes in through the curtains anyway, even when they're shut. And then when we watched the news, she screamed and hugged me and said how brave I was, said Tom, scratching his head. I don't get it. I told him I didn't get it either, and about everything that happened to me after I'd gotten home too, all the neighbours coming over, and about horrible Mr. Greggs, and how Mum had been angry one moment and then happy the next moment, and how she had laughed at what Stan the taxi man had said. "Oh yeah, Dad gave him a cheer too," Tom grinned. "I've never seen him cheer for anything before, except when we dropped off Nana at the airport after she'd been staying with us for a month." We heard footsteps, and Josie and Michael came running up to meet us. "We saw you on the news. Did you give them the note? What did they say?" As soon as Josie and Michael finished asking their questions, Tom and me took it in turns to answer them. As we were talking, lots of people gathered round and asked me and Tom if we were the kids from the news. We were about to say yes when Tom's dad called us over. "Now, listen up," said Tom's dad, kneeling down. "There are going to be a lot of people wanting to ask you all sorts of things about yesterday. And whilst you can tell Josie and Michael and Mrs. Sanders everything—" "And Mrs. Khan," I added. "Yes, and Mrs. Khan." "And Miss Hempsey?" asked Josie. "Okay, yes, her too," nodded Tom's dad, scratching his head in the exact same way Tom does when he's thinking. "But if anyone else asks you what happened, I want you to say exactly what grown-ups say when they're famous and when they've got to keep something a secret. Shall I tell you what that is?" We all nodded and looked at each other excitedly. Famous grown-ups always say no comment when they want to keep something a secret, continued Tom's father. "And that's what I want you to do. Let's all give it a practice right now. Tom, you go first." "No comment," said Tom, thrusting his nose in the air. "No comment," said Josie, grinning. "No comment," said Michael seriously. "No comment," I said loudly. "Good," said Mum. "Now, if anyone asks why you went to Buckingham Palace or what the police said to you or anything about yesterday, you say, 'No comment,'" we all shouted, making all the people at the bus look over at us. My mum and Tom's mum and dad all smiled. "Now, there's a promise we want you all to make too," said Mum. "We want you all to promise us that you won't look at any newspapers today." We all looked at each other, frowning a little, but nodded. "Promise?" asked Tom's mum. "Not a single newspaper." "We promise," we all said, although I could see Josie had her fingers crossed behind her back. "Excellent," said Tom's dad, giving us all a thumbs up. "Now, we've spoken to Mrs. Sanders this morning," said Tom's mum, "and a teacher, probably Mrs. Sanders herself, will be meeting you at the gates to make sure you don't get hounded by the Adra Potter or two. You'll be taken straight to her office because she needs to have a few words with all of you before lessons start." "Oh no," cried out Michael. "Are we all in trouble? Are my parents going to find out?" "It'll be fine, son," said Tom's dad, patting Michael on the back. "I promise." "Now go on, have a good day," said Mum, as our bus came to a loud, hissing stop in front of us. "And we'll see you tonight, and you'll all come straight home," she shouted. We all nodded and waved and ran up to the top deck as usual. The other passengers looked at me and Tom with a frown before looking at their newspapers and then looking back at us again. We hurried past and sat together in a little huddle. In whispers, Josie and Michael told us about their day yesterday. It had been exciting too. Josie said she'd had to make up a story involving a Chinese takeaway and endless buckets of puke to get Mrs. Khan to believe I was sick, but would be back the next day. And Michael had pretended to lose his voice so that he didn't have to say anything to Mrs. Khan when she asked him where Tom was. But of course he kept forgetting that he was meant to have lost his voice, so Josie had to kick him lots of times to make him remember. And then, when the police had rung to tell Mrs. Sanders what had happened, she had come and taken them both out of class and made them tell her everything. Did Mrs. Sanders say anything about giving us detention?" asked Tom. Josie and Michael shook their heads. "Mrs. Khan seemed upset," said Josie, looking down. "I feel bad for lying to her." "Me too," said Michael. "Maybe we should make her a card," said Josie. "Yeah, and I've still got some of the Queen's biscuits left over. We can give her those for her tea," said Tom. But when we got to school, we forgot all about Mrs. Khan because the school was surrounded by hundreds of vans with large, round satellite dishes on their roofs, and lights and microphones and fluffy grey things on sticks, staring at us with hundreds of cameras on legs, which looked like one-eyed insects that could zoom their eyes in and out and swivel their heads in any direction they wanted. And all of them had lots of people bobbing up and down behind them. As we walked towards the gate, a woman suddenly cried out, "There they are!" and started running towards us. I could see Mr. Irons standing by the railings and looking at us, his eyes narrowed and his nose high in the air. His moustache was twitching. "No comment!" shouted Michael as he began running towards the school gate. We all ran too, but before we could reach them, lots of cameras and arms and legs had surrounded us and were blocking our way. "What message were you trying to send our government? Was this an act of protest on behalf of child refugees around the world? What was in the note? Who put you up to this? Where are you from? Where were you born in this country? Would you like to sell us your story?" Everywhere we looked, there were lenses and lights and loud clicking sounds. I clung onto Josie and Michael and Tom as the one-eyed machines all pushed us into a circle. I could hear Josie's breathing beginning to wheeze. She doesn't like tight places, and my hands were beginning to sweat. Michael and me shouted, "No comment!" but I don't think anyone could hear us. "Everybody stand back right now!" came a cry, and just as suddenly as the scary cameras and reporters and microphones had surrounded us, they all instantly moved away, and we could breathe again. "No shame at all!" shouted the same familiar voice, which was getting closer and closer to us. "How dare you harass my kids!" We saw Mrs. Sanders pushing past the cameras like a red-faced bull and reaching out her hands to say, "Stay off school property, and if I see anyone near these kids again, I'll be calling the police and the Queen's guards." Grabbing my hand, Mrs. Sanders stormed back in through the school gates, pulling us like a trailing tail of a kite behind her. She stopped briefly in front of Mr. Irons, who was now standing by the school doors. "Mr. Irons, you were specifically instructed to wait and bring these children in safely. Where were you?" Mr. Irons gave us all a cold stare, his nose deadly quiet. "I'm afraid I didn't see them," he said, his eyes narrowing even more and his moustache getting twitchier. "You didn't see them? Stay here. I will speak to you later." Throwing open the school doors, Mrs. Sanders led us in and stopped to look down at us properly. She was angrier than I had ever seen her, and her whole face was the colour of an extra bright pink peach. "Are you all okay?" she asked. Her voice was back to normal volume now, but it was shaky. We all nodded, too stunned to say anything. "Anyone hurt?" We shook our heads. "Good. Now, all of you are to go straight upstairs to my office," she ordered, looking over her glasses at us. "You'll find Mrs. Khan already there, along with Ahmed and his foster mum and Miss Hempsey, and 2 police officers who want to have a quick word. I'll be up in just a minute. I need a word with Mr. Irons." And waving us along, she hurried back outside.